Secrets worth billions aren't hidden in bank vaults. They are buried in the fine print of contracts nobody understands. When a ruthless French tycoon slipped an untranslatable clause into a mega-merger, elite lawyers were entirely baffled. It took a broke waitress pouring coffee to accidentally unravel a plot that shattered empires. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Le Renard Gris, one of Chicago's most exclusive, impenetrable dining establishments. Inside the atmosphere was a suffocating blend of wealth tension and the heavy scent of roasted duck and aged burgundy. Madeline Ross adjusted the crisp white apron tied around her waist, her feet throbbing after 9 hours on the floor. She was a master of becoming invisible, a crucial skill when serving the city's power brokers who treated waitstaff like pieces of mahogany furniture. Tonight, her assigned section included the private dining alcove currently occupied by the executive board of Harrington Media. Oliver Harrington, the embattled CEO, sat at the head of the long oak table, rubbing his temples. He looked 10 years older than his 55 years, his face pale and drawn under the dim ambient lighting. Opposite him sat his lead counsel, Nathaniel Pierce, a man whose expensive tailored suit could not hide the frantic, nervous energy rolling off him. Spread across the table between crystal water glasses and half-eaten plates of foie gras was a massive leather-bound contract. It was the buyout agreement from Chevalier Industries. Bastien Chevalier was a ghost in the financial world, a French billionaire who had built a media and logistics empire with ruthless precision. He was known for his eccentricities, chief among them his insistence on finalizing major contracts with physical printed documents, often incorporating archaic legal traditions. This merger was supposed to be Harrington's saving grace, a $4 billion lifeline to save his dying company from total bankruptcy. Madeline approached the table silently, a silver pitcher of iced water in her hand. She stepped into the periphery of their intense conversation, her ears catching the hushed, panicked tones of the executives. "I don't like it, Nathaniel," Oliver muttered, tapping a manicured finger against a specific page of the contract. Chevalier's team agreed to all our stipulations, but this addendum at the very end, it's the only part they insisted on drafting entirely in French, and not just standard French. What did the translators say again? Nathaniel sighed, adjusting his tortoise-shell glasses. Oliver, you are letting your paranoia kill the greatest deal of your lifetime. We ran it through 3 different translation firms in New York. We even had our Paris office look at it. It's highly localized legal boilerplate. Bastien Chevalier is from a tiny, obscure commune in the mountains of Corsica. He uses a hyper-specific archaic dialect for his personal addendums as a matter of pride. A flex, if you will. But what does it actually translate to? Oliver pressed his voice tight. Standard operational oversight, Nathaniel replied smoothly, gesturing to a printed email printout attached to the back of the contract. It translates roughly to, in the event of unforeseen market fluctuation, Chevalier Industries reserves the right to guide executive restructuring to ensure the health of the flock. It's a metaphor, Oliver, a rustic European metaphor. It means they want a say in our board appointments if profits dip, which is standard for a buyout of this magnitude. We still retain 51% voting power. Madeline leaned over to fill Nathaniel's glass. As she poured, her eyes instinctively drifted to the thick parchment paper lying open on the table. The text was indeed French, but as she scanned the words, a cold shiver ran down her spine. It wasn't standard French. It wasn't even standard Corsican. It was Gallo-Romance, heavily infused with an extinct rural dialect from the isolated valleys of the Maritime Alps. She knew this, because it was the exact, peculiar dialect her late grandmother Josephine had spoken to her every single day of her childhood. Josephine had grown up in one of those forgotten mountain villages before immigrating to America, and she had stubbornly refused to speak English in the house, forcing Madeline to become entirely fluent in a language that practically didn't exist outside of history books. Madeline's eyes locked onto the phrase Nathaniel had just confidently summarized as ensuring the health of the flock. The actual text read, Si le troupeau perd une seule goutte de lait, le berger confisque la terre et abat les chiens. She blinked her mind, automatically translating the harsh, brutal, rural idiom. It didn't mean operational oversight. It meant if the flock loses a single drop of milk, the shepherd seizes the land and slaughters the dogs. And right beneath it, buried in dense, antiquated legal phrasing that looked like a jumble of misspelled French, to any modern translation, software was the execution mechanism of the clause. It was a poison pill, a financial guillotine. Madeline stood frozen for a fraction of a second too long. The water in the silver pitcher reached the brim of Nathaniel's glass. She caught it just in time, lifting the spout, but her sudden, sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet alcove. Nathaniel snapped his head, up his eyes narrowing at her with immediate disdain. "Are you quite finished hovering?" He snapped his voice, dripping with elitist venom. "We are in the middle of a highly confidential discussion. Do we need to ask the maitre d' for a new server?" Madeline stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a waitress relying on tips to pay off her student loans. She had no business interfering in a multi-billion-dollar corporate merger. Her survival depended on her silence. She bowed her head, clutching the silver pitcher to her chest, preparing to apologize and back away into the shadows where she belonged. But then she looked at Oliver Harrington. He looked terrified, exhausted, and completely unaware that he was about to willingly walk onto a financial landmine that would obliterate everything he had built. He was being lied to not just by Bastien Chevalier, but by the sheer arrogance of his own legal team, who trusted machine translation and lazy associates over genuine comprehension. Madeline took a deep breath. The scent of rain and roasted duck suddenly felt very sharp. Tension thickened the air in the private alcove as Nathaniel glared at her, fully expecting her to scurry away. Instead, Madeline stood her ground. Her grip on the silver pitcher tightened until her knuckles turned white. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir," Madeline said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "But your translators are wrong. Horribly wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Oliver Harrington slowly looked up from the document, his brow furrowing in a mix of confusion and shock. Nathaniel Pierce's face contorted into a mask of pure outrage. "Excuse me," Nathaniel half whispered, standing up from his chair. "Who do you think you are speaking to? Leave this room immediately before I have you fired." "Nathaniel, sit down," Oliver said, quietly, raising a hand. The CEO's desperate eyes locked onto Madeline. He was a drowning man, and the absolute certainty in the waitress's voice was the first piece of driftwood he had seen in months. "What did you just say?" "Oliver, you cannot be serious," Nathaniel scoffed, gesturing wildly at Madeline. "She's a server. You're going to take legal advice from someone holding a water pitcher?" I said sit down. "Nathaniel." Oliver barked, a flash of his old executive authority returning. He turned back to Madeline. "You read French." "I read that French," Madeline corrected, pointing a slender finger at the glowing parchment on the table. "That isn't standard legal terminology. It's an old Alpine dialect. My grandmother was born in a village 20 miles from where Bastien Chevalier was raised. She spoke it exclusively. Modern translation software defaults to the closest modern French equivalent, which sanitizes the meaning completely. Your lawyers in Paris likely saw archaic peasant slang and assumed it was harmless, eccentric posturing." Oliver leaned forward, the blood draining completely from his face. "Translate it for me, exactly as it's written." Madeline stepped closer to the table, her eyes tracing the jagged, sharp lettering of the clause. "Your lawyer told you it means they want a say in board appointments if profits dip. What it actually says is, if the flock loses a single drop of milk, the shepherd seizes the land and slaughters the dogs." In the context of this dialect's property laws, which this contract specifically invokes, it means zero tolerance. She took a breath, translating the dense legal jargon beneath the idiom. It states that if Harrington Media's quarterly revenue falls short of projections by even 0.1% a drop of milk within the first 30 days, post-merger Chevalier Industries doesn't just get board seats. The clause triggers a total forfeiture. It grants Chevalier the unilateral right to seize all executive voting shares at a nominal penalty price of €1 per share. They won't just fire you. They will legally steal the entire company for pocket change. A pen dropped from Nathaniel's hand, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. That's impossible." The lawyer stammered, his arrogance suddenly evaporating into pale panic. "That's a hostile takeover trap. It wouldn't hold up in an American court." The jurisdiction clause at the top of the page dictates all disputes regarding this specific addendum must be settled in an international arbitration court in Geneva under old regional commercial laws, Madeline pointed out softly. "Bastien Chevalier knows exactly what he is doing. He knows your quarterly projections are inflated. He is planning for you to fail by a fraction of a percent so he can gut your company entirely." Oliver Harrington buried his face in his hands, letting out a hollow, defeated sound. He had been minutes away from signing away his life's work, entirely blind to the trap. Before anyone could speak another word, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Standing in the doorway was Bastien Chevalier. He was an imposing figure, impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. His silver hair was swept back, and his dark, predatory eyes immediately took in the scene: the panicked lawyer, the devastated CEO, and the waitress standing far too close to his confidential documents. Behind him stood 2 massive bodyguards and a sleek, sharp-eyed executive assistant holding a silver briefcase. "Oliver." Bastien said, his voice a rich, velvety baritone laced with a thick, intimidating accent. "I was told the paperwork was ready for my signature. Yet you look as though you have seen a ghost." Bastien stepped into the room, his gaze sliding from Oliver to Nathaniel, and finally locking on to Madeline. His eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He possessed the terrifying calm of a predator that knew exactly where all the exits were. "Is there a problem?" Bastien asked, walking slowly toward the table. "Or is the service simply that slow tonight?" Oliver Harrington slowly stood up his hands, trembling slightly, but his jaw was set with newfound resolve. He looked at the French billionaire, then down at the contract. "There won't be a signature tonight. Bastien," Oliver said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "Or ever. Not with this poison pill buried in the back." Bastien stopped. The smooth, charming veneer on his face didn't crack, but his eyes turned completely dead. He glanced at Nathaniel, who was currently sweating through his designer suit, and then his gaze snapped back to Madeline. He instantly deduced what had happened. No one else in this room possessed the intellect or the background to decipher his ancestral trap. Bastien stepped menacingly close to Madeline. He looked down at her, towering over her slight frame. When he spoke, he abandoned English, entirely dropping his voice to a lethal quiet whisper in the very dialect she had just translated. "Tu as fait une très grave erreur, petite fille," Bastien whispered in the harsh, guttural, alpine tongue. You have made a very grave mistake, little girl. You do not interfere with my business. Madeline felt her chest tighten with fear, but the memory of her grandmother's fierce, unyielding spirit flared inside her. She looked the billionaire dead in the eyes and replied in the exact same flawless dialect. Le berger n'a pas de pouvoir si les loups connaissent ses pièges. The shepherd has no power if the wolves know his traps. Bastien Chevalier's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in his legendary ruthless career, the billionaire looked genuinely, profoundly stunned. Silence, thick and absolute, swallowed the private dining room of Le Renard Gris. Bastien Chevalier, a man who had famously stared down aggressive takeover attempts from real-world titans like corporate raider Carl Icahn and outmaneuvered cutthroat European magnates like Vincent Bolloré, stood utterly paralyzed. His jaw tightened as he stared at the young waitress in the stained white apron who had just flawlessly weaponized his own ancestral heritage against him. Bastien did not shout. He did not throw a tantrum. He simply gave Madeline a long, calculating look, a gaze entirely devoid of his previous aristocratic charm, and then turned sharply on his heel. He gestured to his bodyguards and his pale, terrified executive assistant. Without a single word of explanation or a backward glance, the French billionaire exited the alcove, leaving the $4 billion merger dead on the mahogany table. Oliver Harrington exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for 5 minutes. He slumped back into his leather chair, running shaking hands through his thinning grey hair. Beside him, Nathaniel Pierce finally found his voice, though it was an octave higher than usual. "Oliver, I can salvage this," the lead counsel stammered frantically, gathering the scattered papers. "We will contact his Paris office in the morning. We will offer a concession on the voting rights. He's just throwing a theatrical tantrum. We can get him back to the table." "You are fired, Nathaniel," Oliver said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a lethal, chilling finality. Nathaniel froze, the contract slipping from his manicured hands. "You cannot be serious. After everything my firm has done for you. Your firm, which bills me $2,000 an hour, just blindly walked me into a financial slaughterhouse because you were too arrogant to hire a decent linguist." Oliver interrupted, his eyes flashing with renewed fury. "You trusted a machine to translate the demands of a man known for being a ruthless eccentric. Pack up your briefcase, leave your corporate card on the table, and get out of my sight before I sue you for professional malpractice." Humiliated and pale, Nathaniel hastily shoved his documents into his leather satchel and practically ran from the room. Once they were alone, Oliver slowly turned his attention back to Madeline. She was still clutching the silver water pitcher, the adrenaline beginning to crash, leaving her limbs trembling. She felt incredibly small, acutely aware that she had just blown up the biggest financial transaction in Chicago's recent history. "I am so sorry, Mr. Harrington," Madeline whispered, backing away. "I shouldn't have spoken out of turn. I'll go speak to the manager and hand in my apron." "If you hand in your apron, Miss Ross, I will buy this restaurant tomorrow morning and burn it to the ground," Oliver said, a sudden weary smile breaking across his haggard face. He gestured to the empty chair where his former lead counsel had just been sitting. "Please, sit down." Madeline hesitated, then carefully set the pitcher down and took a seat at the billionaire's table. "You saved my life tonight, Madeline," Oliver stated plainly. "But Bastien Chevalier is not a man who walks away from a wounded animal. He knows Harrington Media is bleeding capital. He will launch a hostile takeover by morning. He will bypass the board, go directly to my shareholders, and offer to buy their stock at a premium. Without this merger to stabilize our debt, my investors will sell me out in a heartbeat." Oliver leaned forward, sliding the massive leather-bound contract toward her. Bastien thought he was the smartest man in the room, because he used a dead language to hide his daggers. I want to know every single thing he has ever written. I need you to comb through his previous acquisitions, his public filings in Europe, his subsidiary contracts. I want to know how this man operates. I am putting you on retainer as my chief executive consultant, starting right now for $50,000 a month. Do we have a deal?" Madeline's breath hitched. It was more money than she made in a year, pouring coffee and dodging the wandering hands of entitled investment bankers. She looked at the contract, then at the desperate CEO. "I am not a lawyer, Mr. Harrington. I don't know the first thing about corporate defense." "I have a building full of corporate defense lawyers," Oliver countered. "What I do not have is someone who can read the invisible ink Bastian uses to ruin people. I need your grandmother's language. I need your eyes." By the following Monday, Madeline's life had transformed into a whirlwind of high-stakes corporate espionage. Gone was the stained apron, replaced by a sharp, navy-tailored suit paid for by Oliver's executive account. She was given a sprawling corner office on the 40th floor of the Harrington Media Tower, armed with an endless supply of espresso and mountains of heavily redacted legal documents flown in from Europe. She spent 2 grueling weeks analyzing Bastian's prior conquests. She cross-referenced his hostile takeover of a prominent German logistics firm and his brutal gutting of a Spanish telecommunications giant. The elite lawyers at Wachtell Lipton, Rosen and Katz, whom Oliver had newly hired to replace Nathaniel, were astounded by her findings. Bastian Chevalier had a terrifying, unbroken pattern. He embedded regional archaic alpine clauses into the deepest, most boring sections of his international contracts. Because modern international business courts in Geneva often allowed the inclusion of localized heritage laws to govern specific operational clauses, Bastian had been legally robbing companies blind for a decade, using loopholes written in a language almost no one on Earth still spoke. But as Madeline dug deeper into the ancient texts of the Maritime Alps, cross-referencing Bastian's aggressive clauses with the actual, historical legal codes of his home region, she noticed something glaring. Bastian was arrogant. He was cherry-picking the old laws to benefit himself as the shepherd, completely ignoring the restrictive counter-laws that governed the shepherd's own behavior. Late on a Thursday night, her eyes red-rimmed and burning, Madeline found it. It was buried in a 19th-century Savoyard property code regarding the taxation of stolen flocks. She let out a sharp gasp, slamming her hand down on the desk. Bastian Chevalier had left a back door open, and it was big enough to drive a bulldozer through. Storm clouds gathered over the Chicago skyline as the emergency shareholder meeting commenced in the grand boardroom of Harrington Media. The atmosphere was highly combustible. Bastian Chevalier had spent the last 2 weeks aggressively buying up the company's public debt through shell corporations, successfully backing Oliver Harrington into a corner. Today was the day Bastian intended to force a vote of no confidence, legally deposing Oliver and seizing control of the board. Bastian sat at the far end of the sprawling glass table, looking entirely unbothered. He was flanked by 6 of the most expensive corporate litigators in Paris. Oliver sat opposite him, appearing calm, while Madeline stood quietly in the background, holding a single manila folder. Bastian's eyes flicked to her, a brief flash of irritation crossing his handsome features before he dismissed her presence. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries, Oliver," Bastian said, smoothly lacing his fingers together. "Your stock has plummeted 12% since our merger collapsed. Your institutional investors are panicking. I hold 40% of your outstanding debt. You will step down as CEO today, hand over the voting rights, and I will graciously agree to keep your company out of bankruptcy. It is a generous offer." "It's an execution, Bastian," Oliver replied coolly, "and I decline." Bastian chuckled a dry, humorless sound. You do not have a choice. I have triggered the debt covenants. If you do not surrender control, I will force a liquidation by Friday. You will be left with absolutely nothing. Oliver leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the former waitress. I believe my chief consultant has something to add regarding the legality of your debt acquisition. Bastian's lawyers murmured in confusion as Madeline stepped up to the table. She opened the manila folder, sliding copies of a translated document across the glass to Bastian and his legal team. You are very proud of your heritage, Mr. Chevalier. Madeline began, her voice steady and echoing clearly in the vast room. So proud, in fact, that you tied the jurisdiction of all your shell corporations and the debt they acquired directly to the localized heritage laws of your home commune in the Alps. You did this to avoid standard European Union corporate taxes. A clever trick. Bastian's confident smirk faltered slightly. He leaned forward, staring at the documents. You used the old Savoyard Code to establish your holding companies as agricultural cooperatives under the ancient definitions. Madeline continued, her eyes locking onto his. You invoked the loi du pâturage, the law of the pasture, to shield your assets from standard financial oversight. A perfectly legal structural efficiency, one of Bastian's Parisian lawyers sneered. What is your point, little girl? My point, Madeline said softly, is that you only read the first half of the book. She pulled out the original yellowed copy of the 1842 regional law text she had sourced from a university archive in Lyon, placing it delicately on the table. Under the exact heritage laws you use to legally incorporate your debt-holding companies, a strict code of conduct applies to the entity claiming the role of the shepherd. Madeline explained, transitioning seamlessly into the harsh, guttural dialect of Bastian's ancestors. She read aloud, translating for the shocked room, if the shepherd attempts to seize a neighboring pasture by poisoning the well, his entire flock is forfeit to the village council. Madeline switched back to English, her voice ringing with absolute authority. By intentionally triggering Harrington Media's debt covenants through aggressive short-selling, while simultaneously holding our debt poisoning the well, you have violated the core statute of the very archaic law you use to protect your own money. Under the jurisdiction, you selected Mr. Chevalier. Your hostile actions automatically trigger a forfeiture. Bastian's face drained of color. He snatched the translated document, his eyes frantically scanning the archaic legal text. He was fluent in the dialect, but he had never studied the punitive property laws of his ancestors. He had only ever used the aggressive clauses. "This is absurd," his lead lawyer shouted. "No modern court will uphold a 19th century peasant law." "You cannot have it both ways," Oliver Harrington interjected, a triumphant smile finally breaking through his stoic facade. "You bound your holding companies to this specific jurisdiction to evade EU taxes. We have already submitted these findings to the International Arbitration Court in Geneva. If you proceed with this hostile takeover, you will not only lose the debt you purchased, but the court will freeze your entire European logistics portfolio for violating the foundational charter of your own holding company." Madeline leaned her hands on the glass table, looking directly down at the legendary billionaire. "You tried to slaughter the dogs, Mr. Chevalier," Madeline said quietly. "But you forgot that the pasture bites back." The silence in the boardroom was deafening. Bastian Chevalier sat frozen, staring at the young woman who had just dismantled his multi-billion-dollar empire with a dusty, forgotten law. His lawyers were furiously whispering to each other, their faces pale with panic as they realized the magnitude of the trap their boss had built for himself. Slowly, Bastian closed the folder. The predator had been outsmarted by the prey. He looked up at Oliver, his expression a mask of tightly controlled fury. "Withdraw the filing in Geneva." Bastien said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I will sell the debt back to you at market value. We part ways. Permanently." "Agreed," Oliver said simply. As Bastien Chevalier stood up to leave in utter defeat, he paused next to Madeleine. He looked at her, not with anger, but with a sudden, grudging respect. "Tu es un loup redoutable," he murmured in his native tongue. "You are a fearsome wolf." He walked out of the boardroom, taking his army of lawyers with him, leaving the future of Harrington Media entirely secure. Oliver Harrington broke into a loud, joyous laugh, clapping his hands together. He looked at Madeleine, who was finally letting out a massive sigh of relief. She was no longer an invisible waitress serving expensive water to arrogant men. She was the woman who had just broken the most dangerous billionaire in the world. Madeleine's incredible journey from an exhausted invisible waitress to a high-powered executive consultant proves that true power often hides where people least expect it. She didn't just beat the billionaire. She used his own arrogance against him. If you loved this intense story of corporate warfare and epic linguistic revenge, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life drama.